Call the member for Fraser.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, over the past few decades, as we in this place have debated solutions to climate change, climate science has become increasingly unequivocal. The world is warming and human beings are causing that warming. This parliament sits in a city that shares a close connection to the natural environment. The bush capital is particularly vulnerable to climate change. Unchecked, climate change over the next 5 decades could subject Canberra to more high and extreme fire danger days, more frequent droughts, more scorchingly hot days, those days when elderly people and young kids can't go outside, and less water in our dams. We can't blame any single extreme event on climate change, but we know that more of them will impose a greater cost to households. Canberra's devastating bushfires in 2003 delivered a damage bill of $1/3 billion to what was then just a $16 billion economy. Increase the probability of extreme fire danger days, and you increase the expected cost of bushfires. One way of regarding dangerous climate change is that we should just take on mitigation as a form of insurance. I'm not in the habit of regularly quoting Rupert Murdoch, but as he puts it, climate change poses clear, catastrophic threats. We may not agree on the extent, but we certainly can't afford the risk of inaction. If you accept that asbestos is very likely to cause malignant mesothelioma and bad cholesterol is very likely to increase the risk of a heart attack, then you should accept that society's greenhouse gas emissions are very likely causing global warming. Of course, the Coalition likes to flirt with climate change deniers. Their West Australian branch recently called for a royal commission into climate change science. But in their official policy, the Coalition have recently accepted the science and agreed to an emissions reduction of 5% on 2000 levels by 2020. So the question that we have to think about in this chamber is what's the best way of getting to that bipartisan target? And the choice is clear: direct action versus a market-based approach. The problem is Coalition's policy is indirect and it won't take action the most effective way. When you reject a market-based mechanism and place your faith in command and control, you lose a lot of flexibility. And you can see this, for example, if you look at Australia's projections of renewable energy growth in the decade from 2000 to 2010. At the start of the decade, experts projected that 2/3 of the renewables growth will come from bagasse and none from wind. By the end of the decade, bagasse has contributed less than 1/10 of the renewables increase, while wind had contributed nearly half. When you reject the market-based mechanism, you don't tap the ingenuity of the market. You lock yourself into an inflexible system. We should never forget that a price on carbon pollution isn't just a disincentive to polluters, it's also an incentive to investors and entrepreneurs looking to invest in renewables. Joshua Gans, one of Australia's brightest economists, had this to say about the two contrasting policies. He said the point is that this game could go on with very little impact and possibly negative impact on total emissions. And there's example and example after this. Think of the taxes required to employ all the inspectors and personnel to ensure that regulations are doing what you wanted without unintended consequences. Sure, it can be done, but you'd need a government that would make Lenin blush to make that happen. Contrast that with a carbon price, by tax or trade. That requires none of this because it hits directly on the problem. Emissions create external cost, so we need everyone to build that cost into their decision-making. Problem is, as right-wing economist Friedrich Hayek pointed out, no one has the information regarded to plan out what individuals might do for themselves. By placing the decisions of environmental management in the hands of the people, you can let things work themselves out in a way that heavy-handed government involvement cannot. He goes on to say, I can't pass the dual hypotheses that either the Coalition just deny economic evidence or they actually want more emissions and handouts to business. Perhaps one of their number can enlighten us. And Professor Gans isn't alone in favouring an approach which prices carbon and allows business to innovate in their solution. A poll of members of the Economic Society of Australia, released at July's Australian Conference of Economists, found that 79% agreed with carbon pricing and only 12% supported direct regulation. This isn't some complex economic theory, it's based on lessons from first-year economics. The best way of addressing a negative externality is to put a price on it. And it's not unproven theory either. In 1989, when US President George H.W. Bush proposed the use of a market-based mechanism to deal with acid rain, the electricity generators warned that costs would skyrocket. Today, that market-based emissions trading program is universally regarded as a success. It achieved its emissions targets at around 1/3 of the projected costs. Why was it so successful? Well, researchers found that firms used a variety of approaches to reduce emissions. Some of them retrofitted emissions control equipment, a number switched to cleaner fuels, others retired their dirtiest generators. Because each firm took the lowest cost approach to abatement, the social cost was minimised. The Coalition used to subscribe to such an approach. In 2007, their election manifesto said, "A re-elected Coalition government will establish the world's most comprehensive emissions trading scheme." Deputy Speaker, whenever I speak at schools and universities, I meet young Australians who are optimistic about a clean energy future and want us to get on with pricing carbon. They get the science. They want us to act. Young people can and do make a positive contribution on environmental debates. Indeed, in 1990, one young person argued, quote, "A pollution tax is both desirable and in some form is inevitable." That young person pointed out the national interest must be favoured over sectional interest, saying, quote, "Even if some of the Liberals' constituents do respond negatively, a pollution tax does need to be introduced to properly serve the public interest." Who was this young person? Well, of course, it's the member for Flinders, and his remarks are from his law honours thesis. I cite his work not as some cheap political trick in this place, but rather as a demonstration that there are still some opposite who deep down know that the advice of experts and economists that acting on climate change using the most efficient means possible is the right thing to do. Indeed, as recently as the 28th of April 2008, the member for Flinders told a Sydney audience, "Perhaps the most important domestic policy was the decision of the Howard government that Australia will implement a national carbon trading scheme." But the reticence of Conservatives not to listen to the best advice isn't new. We know that Senator Nick Minchin, political godfather for many of those opposite, didn't accept the scientific evidence on the need to act on smoking and on climate change, which he believes to be some vast left-wing conspiracy to deindustrialise the world. Former Liberal Premier of New South Wales, Nick Greiner, lamented this approach, saying in 1990, "Regrettably, too many people on the Conservative side of politics still view environmental consciousness as some form of left-wing conspiracy. Among both the Liberal and National parties, there's still a cringe when the environment's mentioned, a subconscious aversion that arises, I believe, from a misconception that there's some fundamental philosophical inconsistency between environmental consciousness and democratic capitalism." Sadly, nearly 20 years on, and these remarks are never more relevant. Recent history, including the Liberal Party's leadership change in December 2009, a great example of the fact that tipping points really do matter on the issue of climate change, lay bare this reality. Pricing carbon's in the traditions of capitalism. Business recognises this and been calling for certainty in this policy area. For example, the Energy Supply Association of Australia called for a well-designed emissions trading scheme back in February 2007. Nathan Fabian of the Investor Group on Climate Change has said, quote, "Delaying the introduction of a carbon price is a false economy. We know we must achieve lower domestic emissions, send clear investment signals and support a stronger international agreement. It's time to get on with the job." Like the CPRS, the scheme that we are introducing today has a fixed price period, which, yes, operates like a tax, followed by a floating price emissions trading scheme. For those who dislike fixed prices, also known as carbon taxes, I have good news for you. After 2015, there will be no carbon tax. Under a carbon price, our economy will continue to grow. More than 1.6 million jobs will be created. Jobs in clean and renewable industries. Jobs in industries that are yet to develop. The revolution is already taking place. In my own electorate, we have students and industries taking advantage of this. Earlier this year, I was with the Minister for Resources, who I'm pleased to see in the chamber today, at the Australian National University for a launch of a major project to increase the efficiency of photovoltaic solar cells. The project secured investment from Trinker, a Chinese company that's a world leader in global energy. Late last year, my friend Andrew Barr, MLA from the ACT Legislative Assembly, and I opened the Sustainability Hub at the Canberra Institute of Technology. That facility allows Canberrans to get practical experience in the latest green building applications, materials and new products for residential and commercial sectors, as well as renewable technology like wind and solar. Canberra is already pioneering an electric car grid with battery charge stations provided by Better Place, and I can't help acknowledging the terrific work my friends Evan Thornley and McGregor Duncan do in improving the technology behind Better Place. The world's also harnessing these advantages. We can't afford to be left behind. Reviews have been conducted for governments of both persuasions, and they've been crystal clear on this fact. Those opposite often deride what's going on in China, but China is projected China's wind energy industry is projected to top 150 gigawatts by 2020, and that's up from earlier projections of 30 gigawatts. China is introducing emissions trading schemes in some of its largest cities, including Beijing and Shanghai. It's reported to be planning a nationwide trading scheme to commence in 2015. That's right, a nominally communist economy is more committed to the market than the Liberal Party of Australia. In Canada, 4 provinces, British Columbia, Manitoba, Ontario and Quebec, are partners in the Western Climate Initiative that aims to introduce emissions trading in phases. British Columbia's carbon price is already at $25. In the United States, a coalition of eastern states with a combined population twice that of Australia participate in an emissions trading scheme covering the power sector. California will start a carbon trading scheme in 2012, and it's working with the 4 Canadian provinces to progressively establish a regional trading market from 2012 onwards. International linkage makes economic sense. It's a global problem. We want to get the lowest cost abatement. Japan, South Korea are piloting voluntary emissions trading schemes. South Korea has introduced economy-wide mandatory emissions trading legislation into its parliament in April 2011 to commence in 2015, and it's seeking to pass the legislation this year. All European countries, Australia's top 6 trading partners, China, Japan, United States, Republic of Korea, United Kingdom and India, have implemented or are piloting emissions trading schemes, carbon taxes or coal taxes at the national, state or city level. The fact is, the world is acting, and Australia has a role to play in that action. In December 2009, Christina Rohr, a young person from the Solomon Islands, stood up in front of the world and spoke these words. She said, "I'm 17 years old. For my entire life, countries have been negotiating a climate agreement. My future is in front of me. In the year that I was born, amidst an atmosphere of hope, the world formed the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to solve the climate crisis. I'm confident we can answer Christina's challenge, that a global solution can be found, that collectively we can stabilise our emissions while allowing economies to grow and, importantly, allowing development that will see millions of people brought out of poverty." This Parliament has been debating acting on carbon pollution since Graham Richardson brought a submission to Bob Hawke's cabinet in 1989 to reduce Australia's greenhouse gas emissions. We've had 35 parliamentary reviews into climate change. Deputy Speaker, I'm proud to support this economic reform. This is economic reform that sets our nation up for the challenges of the future. It's the stuff of which Labor governments are made. It's Labor governments that brought down the tariff walls in Australia, Labor governments that floated the dollar, Labor governments that put in place Medicare and implemented universal superannuation. For each of these reforms, it's taken a Labor government to harness the prosperity of the future. None of these reforms were uncontroversial at the time of their enactment, but all of them have paid dividends and increased our nation's prosperity. Deputy Speaker, I'm confident this reform will stand the test of time and secure a clean energy future and the low pollution world of tomorrow.